The Wild West is often defined based on one simplified generalization. It was an era of good and evil, lawmen versus outlaws, heroes versus hostiles, order versus chaos, legends versus scoundrels. It's a tale told throughout history at large and misrepresented through media, such as Hollywood motion pictures, distorting our perspective of what the Western frontier was actually like. In reality, the landscape of the Old West was more of a gray tapestry, an open land, neither black nor white, no matter what you believed to be true. Everyone had an ulterior motive, everyone had secrets to hide, and nobody was ever truly safe in the comforts of a dichotomy. By extension, many of the famous figures of the frontier were not the exact archetypes the long gestating game of telephone would lead you to believe. Rather, many of the lawmen and bounty hunters were committing acts of vigilante justice behind the cloak of goodwill, just like many outlaws weren't unknown to commit acts of charity themselves. While the latter wasn't nearly as popular as the former, it all goes to show the characters of the Wild West were as complex as they come. Many of these double-crossing deputies and empathetic bandits were not given a title of good or evil, but rather blanketed with the term gunfighter. Were gunfighters on the right side of the law, or just as liable to lean into disarray? The answer is both, a fascinating detail of Western lore. To shine a light on one of the more lawful labeled gunfighters, we're taking a deeper dive into the folklore of Dallas Stoudenmire, the Texas Ranger and U.S. Marshal, who tamed one of the most savage settlements in all the West, and the legend of the 4 dead in 5 Seconds Gunfight. Dallas Stoudenmire was born on December 11, 1845, in Aberfoyle, Alabama. His parents, Louis and Elizabeth Stoudenmire, were no strangers to a baby boy. Young Dallas would go on to be one of 9 children. He certainly learned a thing or two early on about establishing order in an atmosphere of utter chaos. At just the age of 15, Stoudenmire had enough of the sibling crossfire and attempted to find refuge on a different kind of battlefield. He enlisted in the Confederate Army, hoping to aid the cause of the rebellion, while he was nothing more than a teenager. At first, his underage status went unnoticed. His 6-foot stature aided his camouflage amongst the other men. After a few weeks, though, the act was up. His superiors did a little digging and discovered that young Stoudenmire's real age was not appropriate for that of a soldier. Twice more, he fooled the enlistment office, and on his 3rd attempt, was ultimately accepted into Company F of the 45th Alabama Infantry Regiment. Stoudenmire's short-lived military career was riddled with injury, spending more time in recovery than on the front lines. He was shot on 2 separate occasions, and neither time was the bullet completely removed from his body. The now 6-foot 4-inch veteran would go on to live the rest of his days with a pair of slugs embedded into his person, ultimately unfazed and hardened at a young age. Once fully rehabilitated, Stoudenmire decided he'd flee the war-torn South and take his talents out west. He slowly trickled across the Mississippi, and by 1867 called Columbus, Texas his new home. During his early tenure in the Lone Star State, the youthful frontiersman was known for a short temper, yet deadly shot. Legend goes, he killed several men long before local law enforcement was established in those wayward South Texas settlements. Stoudenmire's fire-breathing demeanor wasn't an unexplained phenomenon, however, easily attributed to his love of whiskey. He fell in love with moonshine early on in life, and the more intelligent folk knew to avoid sparring with Stoudenmire if an empty bottle lay nearby. When he wasn't shot in the neck, he was actually considered quite pleasant, respectful around the ladies, and stylish in his dress. Into the early 1870s, Stoudenmire found employment in a variety of fields. He was known as a carpenter and wheelwright, a retail salesman, and a sheep herder when he sought more time outdoors. Eventually, he refined his sharpshooting so much he could move on from menial jobs to a more cutthroat profession. He joined the Texas Rangers, fighting alongside the legendary J.R. Waller and his company of lawmen. With the Rangers, Stoudenmire made famous his dual-wielding pistols, having mastered his shot with both his left and his right hand. After 3 years riding the Texas plain, Stoudenmire went off-grid. It's widely accepted he retreated into Mexico, living off the land of the southern Texas Panhandle, where he refined his Spanish-speaking skills. Before long, though, he ventured back across the border, ready to reignite his passion for the law, order, and above all, gunfighting. Sometime around 1878, Stoudenmire settled briefly in Socorro, a growing town of New Mexico Territory. He was swiftly elected town marshal and shaped up the city limits with his unflinching tactics. The nonchalant folk of Socorro dared not mess with their new administrator. It was his rough and rugged role as marshal that led to his next and most notorious contract with the law. After a couple of years serving the people of New Mexico Territory, his brother-in-law, Stanley Doc Cummings, alerted Stoudenmire of an open marshal position in El Paso, Texas. Cummings told the ranger-turned-marshal that El Paso was desperate for new leadership. The deputy marshal was unfit for the job, ignorant to the scum and villainy plaguing the West Texas settlement. El Paso had a reputation for unabashed violence, and those seeking order wanted a new sheriff in town, one known for their grit and gumption, someone who could handle their own, someone without fear. By all accounts, Dallas Stoudenmire was the perfect flatfoot for the gig, his resume simply a bonus. He rolled into El Paso on a muggy Monday morning, the 11th of April, 1881. For 3/4 of the past year, the town had seen 5 marshals all come and go, unable to handle the heat of frontier misrule. Within hours of stepping foot into the madness, members of the city council introduced themselves with an urgent request. They needed Stoudenmire to get right to work, the current deputy marshal Bill Johnson his only hindrance. Johnson, the town sucker, couldn't remember left from right in his consistently inebriated state. Of course, the new town marshal had no time for child's play. Legend goes, Stoudenmire paid a visit to old Johnson, already soaked after a day spent ripened on the budge. The hardened lawman kindly asked for the keys to the jailhouse, keeping things kosher at first. The drunk deputy stumbled over his words, muttering something along the lines of needing to return home and sorting through which keys were his and which keys belonged to the city. Stoudenmire gave Johnson a final chance to cooperate, insisting the keys be transferred to him at once. The drunkard again feigned interest, and Stoudenmire did what he did best. He promptly picked the deputy up, flipped him upside down, shook him until the keys fell from his pockets, and dropped him to the floor, without reservation. He didn't care Johnson had been publicly embarrassed. The new marshal of El Paso meant business and made his mark on the rambunctious boomtown no one would soon forget. Unfortunately for Stoudenmire, though, establishing order wouldn't come nearly as easy in the coming days. The sun was already starting to set, and dusk was quickly approaching. The seeds that would eventually sprout into the legendary 4 Dead and 5 Seconds Gunfight were planted long before Dallas Stoudenmire strolled into El Paso, Texas. Their origin actually hides within the beginnings of the city itself, in its earliest days leading up to the tenure of Marshal Stoudenmire. El Paso was long part of the original Republic of Mexico, flush on the border of Texas and Mexico. It transferred over to United States territory in 1848, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed to initiate the Rio Grande as the border between America and Mexico. For a while, though, it was left on its own accord. The law was more of a theory in El Paso, rather than a tried and true entity. Eventually, the railroad made its way to El Paso, with an increase in settlers along with it. The Hispanic residents populating the border town weren't the most hospitable towards their new white neighbors, and conflicts boiled. With Mexico and an uncharted desert sitting just off the back porch of El Paso's city limits, it also wasted no time in becoming a harbor for the seedy characters and vile villains, taking refuge from the consequences of their misdeeds. Needless to say, it wasn't hard to find a gambling hall or brothel nested in the heart of El Chuco. Some of the most notoriously no-good madcaps were none other than the Manning brothers. The family consisted of George Doc Manning, one of the few doctors residing in El Paso. He was joined by Jim, Frank, and John Manning, all veterans of the Confederate Army. Their specialty? Rustling livestock, and their favorite locale? Just across the border into Mexico. On one such occasion, the Bandit brothers crept into Mexico in early 1881, crossing the Rio Grande before thieving at least 30 cattle. Back in El Chuco, the Mannings hid their lucrative head of cattle on the ranch of a good friend and fellow rustler, John Hale. Their plan was to auction off the cattle in due time, keeping the cash for themselves and pretending as if nothing happened. Unfortunately for the Mannings, the 30 stock weren't any old cattle, but rather the prized possession of a wealthy Mexican rancher. The rich cowpoke wouldn't let the theft of his beef and leather go unpunished, and quickly alerted the northerly Texas Rangers. A ranger by the name of Ed Fitch was put on the case, but the rancher couldn't wait for due process. Instead, he hired 2 of his most trusty farmhands to investigate themselves, while they waited for Detective Fitch. These 2 assistants, named Huarique and Sanchez, followed the trail up north, across the Rio Grande, and into El Paso. Eventually, they tracked down the ranch of John Hale, but once there, they wouldn't be seen alive again. Days later, Fitch finally arrived at Hale's ranch himself. He was conducting a routine canvass when he stumbled upon the shallow grave of 2 murdered Mexicans. Inside were the bodies of Huarique and Sanchez. Not long after, a couple of anonymous witnesses overheard Hale's farmhands, named Paveller and Stevenson, bragging about killing off 2 Mexicans. Fitch was tipped off, and the outspoken cowhands were promptly arrested. Hardly any time passed before the news was delivered to the doorstep of the wealthy Mexican rancher. The man was absolutely furious, dead set on delivering swift justice, vigilantism or otherwise. He sent 75 willing Mexican men, some militia, some nothing more than farmhands themselves, to descend on El Paso and make John Hale pay. Upon entering the settlement, however, the posse got cold feet. They realized they didn't actually want to partake in a ploy of vengeance, and went against their boss's orders by allowing the El Paso law enforcement to settle the score. Ignorant to the city's corruption, they forewent their orders and passed the matter on to a local El Paso constable, Gus Kremkaw. Kremkaw was sympathetic to the Mexicans and sped up the process by bringing the 2 arraigned farmhands in front of an El Paso judge. He could speak fluent Spanish himself and acted as a prosecutor of sorts on behalf of the victims. Of course, John Hale and the Manning brothers would have none of it. Despite their status as a band of brutish outlaws, they were immensely powerful in El Paso and had a ragtag team of fellow criminals and business partners by their side. Their entire faction showed up to the courtroom on the day of the inquest and barraged the Mexicans with slurs and slights and unrelenting prejudice. The atmosphere at the courthouse became far too volatile for the judge to reasonably continue the inquest. He told both sides to return at a later date and instructed the crowd to quell their insults if they wanted any sort of end to the matter. Paveller and Stevenson's murder charges were upheld. Both men kept imprisoned. Constable Kremka was furious himself. He didn't think his assistance of the Mexicans would cause such a mean-spirited stir. It was so much more than just tensions, though. There was an air of seething violence surrounding Kremka, regardless of where he retreated. This was the malicious mood hanging over El Paso, like a thundercloud of hatred and inevitable brutality, when Dallas Stoudenmire walked its streets for the first time as the new town marshal. It goes without saying, he had his hands full, albeit unbeknownst to him. The extent of the precarious predicament had been smartly held in secrecy before his arrival. Soon thereafter, at a nearby El Paso tavern called Keating's Saloon, Constable Kremka attempted to find respite. It was April 14th, 1881, merely 3 days after Stoudenmire's recent appointment. At Keating's was another former town marshal, George Campbell. Campbell had been amongst the agitators during the recent inquest. His dislike for the Mexicans was no secret. As Kremka entered Keating's, he overheard Campbell lash out with yet another racist tantrum, boiling rage spilling over in the face of the constable. Campbell was reported as saying, "Any American that is a friend of Mexicans ought to be hanged," along with a slew of other slanderous epithets. At this point, Kremka had had enough. Lucky for him, his pistol and rifle were lodged behind the bar top. Before he could quick-draw Campbell, however, the infamous gunfight started prematurely. Sitting next to Campbell was none other than John Hale. Hale's fury towards Kremka's role in the case had reached its apex, and he grabbed one of Campbell's pistols, firing at the constable and delivering a wounding strike. Across the street, Dallas Stoudenmire was enjoying his dinner when he heard the gunfire. Wasting no time in attending to his duties, the marshal ran across the street, barged in a Keating saloon, and fired his own pistol at John Hale. Despite its legendary aim, Stoudenmire misfired and instead hit a Mexican civilian. The innocent bystander fell to the ground, the first man dead. Stoudenmire steadied his shaking hand, corrected ever so slightly, and with his next shot killed off Hale, the second man dead. Kremka, meanwhile, was bleeding out, but didn't have time to die quite yet. He gathered one of his firearms and struck George Campbell without fail. Kremka then toppled over, succumbing to his mortal wound, now the third man dead. Campbell, not in great shape himself, used the last bit of energy to wander outside the tavern, shouting into the streets, "You son of a bitch, you've murdered me." He also toppled over, the fourth man dead. True to its folklore name, the entire gunfight lasted just 5 seconds. The drama saturating El Paso, though, was far from over. Stoudenmire had just formed a faction of fearless enemies. It didn't matter the exploits on his resume any longer. It didn't matter if he just laid waste to a ruthless cattle rustler in seconds, or if he'd established control over a settlement severely lacking it. The Manning brothers were out for blood now, the blood of a bold town marshal. At first, the Mannings wanted to place the burden of assassinating Stoudenmire on someone else's hands. They somehow convinced the previous deputy marshal, the always intoxicated Bill Johnson, to hang their dirty laundry. Johnson didn't need much persuading, though. He remembered how humiliated he was after the previous week's key fiasco. On April 17th, Johnson drank until he was wasted and found a pile of bricks to squat behind, a double-barreled shotgun in hand. After a couple hours of twiddling his swollen, rosy thumbs, he heard the booming voice of Stoudenmire and his brother Doc Cummings. The drunkard, as stealthy as ever, fell back when he drew his rifle, wobbling onto his bottom and discharging a pair of shells into the night sky. Stoudenmire didn't flinch, quick-drawing his pistols akimbo style and firing 8 shots at Johnson. The old deputy's testicles were struck and severed clean from his body, blood pooling onto the ground at record pace. He died moments later. The Manning brothers' fiery hatred of the El Paso Marshal only grew as Stoudenmire continued his rampage of order over the next year or so. By the winter of '82, he had killed a total of 10 men in shootouts, lowering the crime rate unlike anyone had ever seen in the likes of El Chuco. Come Valentine's Day, 1882, the Mannings were at wit's end. No longer could they bear witness to their rivals' storied successes. James ran into Doc Cummings, and without fail, the pair engaged in a heated argument. At a certain point, guns were drawn, and the lone Manning brother shot Cummings dead. When confronted about it, James insisted it was all an act of self-defense. According to the outlaw, Cummings had threatened his life when an anonymous citizen walked past them. Apparently, Cummings screamed at the bystander, "Now are you not one of his friends?" To which the man claimed he was innocent. When the citizen was allowed to leave on the condition he walked slowly with his hands raised high, Cummings noticed James Manning had escaped. He followed him into the nearby saloon, continuing with the threats against his life. At this point, James explained he'd had enough of the pestering and challenged Stoudenmire's brother-in-law to a duel. "We will settle this for now and all," proclaimed the Manning bandit, and the two exchanged gunfire. Cummings was the only one dealt a mortal blow, and was left to cry out in pain in the lonely El Paso streets. It was there he drew his last breath. Stoudenmire was beside himself, but attended to the matter by the letter of the law. James Manning was arrested, but thanks to the continued corruption of the El Paso court system, was acquitted on all charges. This was the final straw for the town marshal. He let everyone know he was not to be crossed henceforth, especially by anyone in the dastardly Manning family. For weeks, folks avoided the smoking temper of Dallas Stoudenmire. Manning sympathizers dared not share the same side of the street as he, knowing the consequences could flirt with an early demise. Unfortunately for Stoudenmire, his vengeful and intense bravado could only take him so far. The trepidation he elicited in others wouldn't last forever, and without the only confidant he had in El Paso, there was no one else to offer protection or control his madness. Respect for the gunslinger only went as far as the Texas Rangers and U.S. Marshal's office. Most of the city he sheriffed didn't particularly like him, even if they looked up upon him with terror. At the same time, Stoudenmire wasn't handling the loss of Doc Cummings well on a personal level. His affliction with whiskey and alcohol at large was affecting his standing in the community, and more importantly, city council. On May 27, 1882, he was sacked from his position as town marshal. After breaking into council chambers in an intoxicated rage, Stoudenmire demanded he keep his job. The council members were so fearful they initially agreed, but in the end it didn't matter. He knew his time in El Paso had come to an unceremonious end. He sobered up and resigned anyway 2 days later on May 29th. While he was no longer chief of the Sun City, Stoudenmire wasn't quite done as a lawman. After a brief time following the footsteps of his brother-in-law as proprietor of the local Globe restaurant, U.S. Marshal Harrington Hal Gosling appointed him as a newfound deputy marshal. He was assigned to work the Western Texas and New Mexico Territory precinct. The badge bought Stoudenmire a bit more time, but the fermenting distaste for the deputy marshal simply wouldn't die off. The Manning brothers were biding their time, careful to avoid his presence alone, only crossing paths if more than one of them happened to be together. Their hesitance stemmed from an interaction in the summer of '82, when the drunk Stoudenmire saw all four of the brothers sitting inside a saloon while he mocked and taunted them from the street. Doc, John, Frank, and James dared not move. A hapless bystander found the courage to push the marshal away, telling him to go home, sleep off the budge, and give it up. Luckily for the brothers, Stoudenmire relented. Ultimately, the Mannings would have their way. Knowing they'd never best the vaunted gunslinger and his frontier renowned sharpshooting in a duel, they hatched a scheme to corner him under the pretense of peace. Thus, they offered a faux end to the feud in September of 82, telling Stoudenmire they could sign a peace treaty of sorts, and that would be the end of their contest. On the 18th of September, all 5 men gathered at an El Paso tavern. At first, all seemed quiet on the Sun City front. The adversaries agreed to end their feud, and the Mannings figured the matter was settled. That is, until Stoudenmire couldn't help himself to get one last dig in, quoted as saying, "Doc, someone or somebody has been going about telling lies." Doc responded, saying, "Dallas, you have not kept your word." To which Stoudenmire rekindled the fire, shouting, "Whoever says I have not tells a damn lie." It proved to be the final straw for the Manning brothers, unable to ignore it any longer. Doc and Stoudenmire drew their pistols and fired a single shot. One of the Marshal's few friends in El Paso attempted to push each man out of the way, sending Stoudenmire squarely in the crossfire. Doc's shot slugged him in the arm, rendering it useless. The armed Manning brother fired a second time, this one striking the Marshal's chest, but hardly delivering any damage, the folded papers in his breast pocket softening the blow. Stoudenmire stumbled and fell on his back, using his good arm to draw his other pistol and return fire. The grazed gunslinger took his turn to shatter an arm, striking Doc with ease. James Manning, though, was 2 steps ahead of the Marshal. He whipped around behind Stoudenmire from outside the doorway, drew his weapon, and blasted 2 shots. The first misfired and hit the barber's pole. The second ruptured just behind the Marshal's left ear. Dallas Stoudenmire died instantly. Doc Manning wasn't quite done releasing a year's worth of boiling rage, and pistol-whipped the corpse of Stoudenmire over and over and over again, until James had enough and restrained his brother. The last nail in the coffin of El Paso's most fiery feud had finally been hammered down, as had the nail in the coffin belonging to Dallas Stoudenmire. He was given a proper funeral at the El Paso Lodge. Without much surprise to anyone, it was sparsely attended, save for his wife and a few rangers and fellow deputy marshals. Afterwards, the body was sent off to Columbus, Texas, Stoudenmire's original frontier stopping grounds. As of today, he's buried at the Alleyton Cemetery in Colorado County, Texas. In the preceding months of Stoudenmire's shootout demise, the Manning brothers were eventually arrested and stood trial for the murder of El Paso's former town marshal. While Stoudenmire was long gone, the corruption all throughout El Cucho was not. A judge and jury made up of sympathizers to the Mannings quickly acquitted their friends. Doc, Frank, and James would all go on to live well into the 20th century. Frank Manning even took a turn at Marshal of El Paso, taking their reins after the benefactor to Stoudenmire, Assistant City Marshal Thomas Mode, was killed during an investigation into a Sun City brothel in July of '83. Legend goes Frank Manning refused to arrest his El Paso pals and was fired mere months after his appointment. As for Dallas Stoudenmire, the Texas gunslinger was soon forgotten after his blood dried up and his effects collected by his family. El Paso would continue to boom into the 1890s, and with it, so did the crime rates and violence, so inevitable to the West Texas border town. While he may have met an unceremonious end as a result of his short, whiskey-fueled temper, Dallas Stoudenmire still stands as one of the more feared and unforgotten marshals of frontier lore. The Old West was the perfect place for a man of his skill and demeanor. He undoubtedly goes down in history as a legendary gunslinger, unafraid of the black cats blotting his western domain.